With games nowadays constantly trying to push the boundaries on how realistic they can look, I think it's important to recognize that there will always be a place for games from a simpler era: retro games. Now, I'm not just talking about new games made today that are inspired by retro games, but the classics from days of yore. Because no matter how old art gets, it will always still be art, where its value can be appreciated and admired today. Games are an interesting art form because of the direct interactivity the consumer has with it. Music you listen to, movies you watch, books you read, but games, you have control over the actions that transpire. And the same way an older movie, novel, film, show, album can still be enjoyed today, older games made before the modern conventions that we're used to can still be enjoyed by players today. But what exactly is retro? It's a bit of a vague term that has different meanings depending on who you ask. There's an underlying consensus, usually limiting to just games that prioritize sprites as the main visual enforcer. My old metric was simply saying any game/console over 10 years old is retro, since it's simple and gets a reaction when you start calling the PS4 and Xbox One retro consoles. But that's too lame. My current outlook that I think most people can get down with is understanding that retro is a style, but true retro games come from an era where the primary display was a CRT, where games played at a resolution of either 240p or 480i. I feel the true modern game generation wasn't really born until the 7th generation, where consoles used HDMI to plug into flat panel HD TVs. So what I would consider retro consoles would be systems like the NES, SNES, N64, Master System, Genesis, PlayStation, all those old consoles. But that would also include GameCube, Xbox, and PS2, as those systems, despite being perfectly playable on flat screens at the time, were mostly played on CRTs and are preferred played that way. This also means, yes, I would consider the Wii a retro console, while the PS3 isn't, since the Wii doesn't have HDMI. And despite the Wii being able to run in 480p, as well as several games from the 6th gen, they were all mostly played in 480i at the time. The Xbox 360 is kind of an outlier since it didn't launch with HDMI, but still prioritized HD resolutions and was eventually shipped with an HDMI input. Look, I know it's a little confusing, but that's how I see retro gaming as of the making of this video, and my definition, as well as everyone else's, is subject to change in the future. After all, it's not like those systems were considered retro at the time. The point here is that games from those consoles still have value and are worth playing today. Just because it's old doesn't mean there isn't any fun to be had. Unfortunately, playing games from those retro consoles isn't as simple nowadays as it was 10 to 15 years ago, and it will continue to get more challenging as we go forth into the future. So if you're someone who wants to get into retro games, then I'd like to do my best to give a few pointers on where to start. Keep in mind, I'm no professional on the technical machinations of retro gaming. If you want something like that, then I would highly recommend channels such as My Life in Gaming, Retro RGB, and Digital Foundry Retro, just to name a few. If you're someone already familiar with those channels and already have a vast understanding of retro games, then I'm afraid there probably isn't anything useful for you in this video. If you're someone who hasn't played retro games in a long time or hasn't at all, then feel free to keep watching. So before someone's journey into retro games, I'd like to establish 3 rules that I think are important to consider before you make any hasty decisions. Number 3 is going to be knowing your desires. Whether it's to play just one game in particular, a whole system's library, or games from several consoles. Do you want to play games on an old CRT TV, or would you prefer a newer HD TV? Are you a stickler for using the original console, an original copy of the game? Would an emulator suffice? A clone console? Do you care about what controller to use, or how the graphics look? These are all choices that I'd recommend thinking about so that you're sure on where to go. Retro gaming may not be as simple as it was then, but the benefit nowadays is that you have more choices than ever. Number 2 is going to be to know your limitations. Even if you're dead set on playing retro games in a particular way, it will do you some good to stay humble and to know where your own boundaries are. After all, playing retro games now can either be financially crippling or practically free. Unfortunately, many retro game materials from game consoles, old TVs, and the games themselves are a finite source, and in recent years the demand has gone up considerably, at least in North America. Not so much because of scarcity, but because people just aren't willing to part with what they have anymore, so prices have skyrocketed. Luckily, I think that regardless of what your ultimate end goal is, there will be a perfectly satisfactory option for you that will be comfortably achievable, if you're willing to put a little work into it. Finally, at number 1 is to have fun. Look, at the end of the day, the ultimate goal here is just to play some damn games. So as long as you're playing games you want to play in a comfortable enough format and you're having fun, then congratulations, you win. So from here on out, I'll go through what you can expect when you choose how to play your retro games, with the materials I have available to me for my own endeavors. So, are you ready? Well then here we go. So let's say you want to play retro games in the most old school way possible, with the original system and an original copy of the game and an old CRT TV. Well, that's simple enough and can be easy if you know where to look. For starters, getting your hands on an old TV will probably be the most tricky, as they're not exactly sold in stores anymore. You could probably find a CRT on eBay or on Facebook Marketplace. You might know someone like a friend or family member who has one and is willing to part with it, or maybe a coworker who has one lying around. My tips here would be don't spend too much on one, as these displays are valuable through niche alone. Don't get hung up on the quality of any one CRT, as the benefits of playing on a CRT can be found on just about any model from the 80s to the 2000s. You don't need to play on a PVM, which weren't even marketed to regular consumers. Of course, if you can get your hands on one and are willing to shell out the cash, then by all means go for it. But like I said, the benefits of a CRT are found on even the most basic models. One benefit being zero input lag, which is the delay between a button press and the corresponding action within a game. You want games to be as responsive as possible, so zero lag could be very desirable for you. Another benefit is black levels and brightness values. Since most modern LED TVs operate with a single backlight, even the blackest scenes will still shine a bit and have a little brightness, and bright moments won't have the same glow as you get with a real CRT. These benefits can possibly be had on an OLED TV, but those are quite expensive, and unfortunately I don't have one at this moment in time. I can say that compared to retro games on an HD TV, playing on a CRT just has a different feel to it, where your eyes interpret the image in a way that's very different to an HD TV. This brings me to the main benefit of playing on a CRT, how sprites are portrayed. See, now we're all pretty used to the retro look, with sharp pixels, right? But this isn't how retro games looked back then. Back then, CRTs would blend the pixels in a way that gave the illusion of more detail than what was technically there. Your eyes filled in the blanks, and it's why you often get people saying how games looked better back then, because they really did. Luckily, this is a benefit that doesn't require an actual CRT anymore, but we'll talk about that later. But still, the value of a CRT is rather niche. Unless you must play on one, then I think you're better off with other options that we'll discuss later. CRTs can be a piece of work. They're bulky, heavy, and are a pain to get rid of since you can't just toss them in the trash. They can also be home to visual problems like screen warping from age alone. I'll say if you're in a position to comfortably repair anomalies like this, then go for it. If you're not in a comfortable enough position, then try not to let it bother you. Sometimes the imperfections just add to the charm, and the more you play a game and enjoy it, the less these little things will bother you. Now for the console, that's relatively simple if you know what kind of console you want to play on. Of course, that doesn't mean any console is easily obtainable, but as long as you're willing to spend the cash, then most systems are fairly priced. My concern would be the condition of the console itself. Since many are so old now, they may be subject to various issues caused by age. Failing capacitors on circuit boards have already caused problems for some people, so stay alerted and informed before you make a purchase. They may have also had neglectful owners who didn't take care of them as much as others. Remember, these systems were just seen as toys back then. If I was buying a console, I'd make sure it's clean and at least fully functioning. Should a console you buy have some kind of fault with it, then you may be on your own to figure it out. And I would advise seeking a form of repairing or replacement exchange rather than junking a console entirely. These things are too finite and special to be thrown out just because of one little issue. Also know, the more obscure your console, the more it'll cost, so you're really going to have to weigh your own personal benefits to see if it's worth it. For example, I don't have an Atari Jaguar, and while there are some games I'd be interested in playing, I'm not going to shell out the large cost just to satiate a minor curiosity. But say you do get your hands on a console, where do you go from there? For starters, consider the three main connections of the console: the controller, power supply, and AV cable. For controllers, it's generally best to use first-party ones if you can get one that's held up well. I'll admit, I'm rather picky with controllers and I've bought more than I need just to have ones in good condition at the ready. Whenever a controller re-releases in some fashion, that's a great opportunity to get a good conditioned one if the prices are fair enough. And luckily nowadays, several respectable third-party alternatives may have options that'll suit your needs. I'd recommend 8-Bit Do for most cases since they have a good track record and I've been happy with the products I've purchased from them. There's also stuff like the Retro Fighter's N64 controller, which can be a great alternative since the original N64 controller notoriously ages like spoiled cream cheese. If you want to be really galaxy-brained, you can just use a modern controller on an older console via some kind of adapter. Many retro games have simple controls that are perfectly playable on a modern gamepad, so if that works for you, then all's good. Power supplies are simple, just use the one that would have come with the system. I'm not aware of any known good alternatives should you end up in a situation without an authentic power supply. Now the most complicated part, the audio and video or AV cable. This may cause complications because there's the cable itself and then the actual audio video signal that comes from your console. Now if you plan to play on a CRT, then I say don't worry about a damn thing. Just use the cheap cables that most likely came with your system and call it good. The cheap cables in question are composite cables, which I like to think even younger generations know so I don't feel old. These are the red, white, and yellow cables that most retro consoles came with. Before composite, there was RF, which you would normally plug into a box of some sort, and then plug the box into the coaxial plug on the TV, which would then tap into channel 3, as that was the unused reserved channel where the console's audio and video will reside. But RF is very outdated and inconvenient, so usually when we're talking about bottom of the barrel video signals, we usually talk composite. Now again, if you play on a CRT, then frankly, composite is fine enough. After all, this was the way most players played back then. But if you're after more quality, then you're in luck, as many consoles actually had much higher quality video signals that just weren't commonly used. The next step would be S-Video, which is great if you have it available to you. I'll admit I don't have much experience using S-Video, so unfortunately that's all the help I can provide. At the top is RGB. Now, RGB is kinda a whole different beast altogether, and if you want to learn more, then I highly suggest checking out My Life in Gaming, as that's where most of my current knowledge on retro video signals comes from. In short, RGB is the highest quality video signal generated from retro consoles that support it. It's basically HD in the retro analog world. In a CRT environment, then frankly going for RGB provides little benefit, as the natural blurring and blending of a CRT doesn't show that much improvement compared to composite. However, in a situation where you want to play on a newer TV, then having RGB could be very advantageous to you. Of course, you'll need to check if your desired console even supports RGB at all, as several consoles don't. The NES doesn't, N64 doesn't, and SNES Junior models don't either. You can have these consoles modded to support RGB, but that's a path I'll let you handle on your own. Again, My Life in Gaming as well as Retro RGB are fantastic sources of knowledge should you be interested. If your console supports RGB, then you'll need a proper cable to send the signal, as the red, white, and yellow composite cables can only do, well, composite. The most popular cable type now is SCART. However, there is an influx of poorly made SCART cables that will cause you problems if you're not careful. I believe Retro Access has the highest quality cables. They aren't cheap, but they aren't built cheap. My SCART cables come from Retro Gaming Cables, and while I haven't had any problems with the cables I own, there are reports of these cables malfunctioning and even breaking some people's systems, so stay alert. There's also factors like sync type, but I can't go over that or we'll be here all day. Again, these channels will save you many a headache, I swear. Component cables can also be a great option for you. Component is basically another form of RGB, but one most people from North America are familiar with, and most useful since many HD TVs still support this input type. SCART will most likely need an upscaling device to connect to your TV if you're in North America. Speaking of which, that brings us to the next crux: playing older consoles on a newer TV. I really wish I can say just plugging the consoles into an HD TV would be good enough, but it ain't. Look, long story short, many of these retro systems output a very low resolution, either 240p or 480i, and straight up, HD TVs aren't meant to receive such a low resolution. Even if you can just plug in your console straight away, it'll likely look like trash, and it's why many people don't think these games have held up that well visually. HD TVs don't upscale games well, and if you want to play original systems, then you'll need an upscaler. Before, there was a luxury device known as the FrameMeister, which was the only known device at the time that properly upscaled older systems. And if your console had RGB, then you would basically get emulator quality video with sharp pixels, something I didn't believe until I saw it. However, the FrameMeister itself is old tech and is hilariously expensive to buy nowadays. But luckily later we got the OSSC, which at face value was a budget alternative. It uses a different upscaling technique called line multiplying, where it would simply double, triple, or quadruple the game's output resolution so that your TV did less work to finish the upscale. The The problem there is that since many games operate at oddball resolutions, the final resolution sent to your TV may be too whack for the TV to handle. Basically, while the OSSC is great, there is a compatibility concern, so if possible, I'd check to make sure your TV would even support the OSSC before buying one. I was lucky enough to have a compatible TV, and the OSSC is how I spent playing retro games on an HD TV for many years. And be aware that upscaling to a higher resolution doesn't mean games are rendered at a higher resolution. That's a totally different ballgame. Think of it like this. Playing Wii games on your Wii U will have them upscaled to 1080p, but the video will still look pretty low resolution because the Wii games are still being rendered at 480, which is the Wii's predominant resolution. However, through the emulator Dolphin, Wii games can be rendered at 1080p or above, leading to a much cleaner image. This is not to say upscale to low resolutions look bad, it's just important to know the difference. Now, if you want the best upscaling devices on the market right now, I wholeheartedly recommend the line of RetroTink products. These devices are top quality, and there's something to meet everyone's need, whether you just want a convenient way to plug your older system to an HD TV, to a premium device that will not only effortlessly upscale just about anything thrown at it, but is packed with features that will satisfy any retro enthusiast. I'd wager that the best gaming upscaler right now is the RetroTink 5X. Now, I don't want this to turn into a review of this device, so if you want to learn more, check out RetroRGB's video on it, but in short, the 5X will upscale just about any retro system to just about any TV. Compatibility is very high and the results speak for themselves. If you have a console that supports RGB, then with the 5X you will get razor-sharp pixels straight to your TV, and it may look even better than official emulators offered on newer systems. Except it comes from the original console. I know, it's pretty whack. The real great thing about the 5X though, in my opinion, is all the different filter settings to give it a CRT look. I think this is very important because this means even if your console doesn't have the highest quality video signal, if you just use composite, then you can still get a respectable image thanks to the filters offered by the 5X. With new updates including HDR support and an experimental 1440p mode, you can get shockingly close to the look and brightness of a real CRT. The effect is even more convincing on an OLED to my understanding. The 5X is a $300 device, which sounds like a lot, but the value and versatility of what it does makes the 5X worth every penny. I've seen people back up their VHS tapes to digital with it, and that's just beautiful. Okay, now all I've said about using an upscaler and all that crap, I think that's only really useful if you have several consoles you want to play on an HD TV. Say you only have one system and you just want a convenient way to plug it in with little hassle. Well, may I recommend an HDMI mod then? HDMI mods will usually fit your console with an HDMI input and will have a proprietary upscaler to output 1080p to make your console look really nice on a new TV in HD. This route is great if you only have one system and really enjoy the sharp pixel emulator look. HDMI mods tend to be more expensive than RGB mods, but that's fine if you only have one console. There are new types of HDMI mods coming out that simply provide the console with a very high quality digital signal and an HDMI port that are much cheaper and would be great to use with an upscaler like the 5X. That just about covers everything I wanted to talk about regarding the consoles itself, and I apologize if that took a while. Again, there's so much to consider nowadays, but at least more options means more people can be satisfied. As far as the games themselves, then, well, that's the real challenge, as the demand for retro games is higher than ever. 10 years ago, most GameCube games could be found for like $20, but now the average GameCube price is like $70 or more, and it's even worse for systems older than that. Like with weighing in the worth of using an upscaler for several consoles or an HDMI mod for just one, I think that if you just want to play one game, then maybe only paying one outrageously high price isn't that bad, if there isn't a re-release on a newer console that doesn't satisfy you, and as long as the game is in very good condition to justify it. My physical collection of retro games isn't that large compared to most gaming channels because I've only spent the money on games that actively interest me, and this was also a joint effort by my friend who snagged what games he could. This has been a 10+ year effort, and while it isn't a very large collection, it's very personal to me. Though, if I didn't have any of these games already in a physical form, then I probably wouldn't bother buying any today, just because of how the used game market is nowadays. Thankfully, there is another alternative for playing games on original consoles: flash carts and optical drive emulators. Flash carts are pretty self-explanatory. It's a cartridge made to fit into the console you want to play, with an SD card slot where you can load up ROM files to play just about any game you want. Compatibility may not be 100% for every game, but usually you can trust that whatever game you want to play can be loaded on a flash card. Flash cards also allow you to play certain ROM hacks on original hardware if that's something that interests you. Sometimes you can even use emulator features like save states. I have several flash cards for a couple of systems, all EverDrives from Crix. I'm not familiar with other flash card solutions, but I've been remarkably happy with the EverDrives I have and would honestly recommend them more than buying individual games physically. EverDrives aren't cheap, but you do pay for quality, and if you plan to play many games from a system, then you'll likely save money buying an EverDrive. The counterpart to flash cards are optical drive emulators for systems that use disks. I'll admit I don't have a system fitted with an ODE, but the basic gist is that it's a mod for your system that replaces the disk drive with an SD card reader where games can be loaded and played with homebrew software. Homebrew is beer or any other alcoholic beverage that's brewed at home. But in the context of gaming, homebrew is software, games, emulators made by unofficial developers to be used on your console. Sometimes an ODE isn't necessary, like with the GameCube, where you can load games from an SD card with an adapter that goes in the memory card slot and an action replay disc. An ODE here would just be for convenience or an alternative if your disk drive no longer functions. I'll trust you to do more research on it if that's something that interests you. Though if you do go that route, and this applies to flash cards as well, then I'd advise still purchasing the games you play if they're available on newer systems to support the developers. I won't advocate for piracy, but I do understand when there's no option available. If you want to learn more about the complications on that issue, then I'll have a link to Neryl's video. This does lead me to the next consideration if playing on original consoles doesn't interest you at all: software emulators. For those unfamiliar, an emulator can be used to mimic another console to play games on a different one. This isn't new and has been a way to play old games for a very long time. The Zelda promotional disc on GameCube, for example, has all the games emulated to play them, and need I mention the Virtual Console, PlayStation Classics, Switch Online, and Xbox's backwards compatibility. These are all official emulators because they are provided by the publishers themselves and are purchasable. Other game compilation releases are also likely emulators like Sonic Mega Collection, Mega Man Legacy Collection, and the recent Konami releases for Castlevania and Contra. Again, these are official and are a great way to play the games if you don't want to hunt down original systems and all that. There are also unofficial emulators that are used on computers and are by far the most popular. I'll be honest, I haven't had much recent experience with emulators on PC, so if you have a computer and want to pursue emulation, then I'll leave you to do that on your own. I will say there are a number of advantages to be had when using emulation on PC, such as higher rendering resolutions, cheats, various controller support, and possible advancements to improve the gameplay experience. I'll link Neryl's other video on this topic as he's much more experienced than I am. Another form of emulation that has been getting more attention recently is FPGAs, or Field Programmable Gate Arrays. Some of you may be familiar with Raspberry Pis, which are little devices of little cost that can run software emulators to play retro games. Official examples include the various classic consoles that have come out over the past couple of years, a fine way to play retro games. FPGAs, in the most basic way, are hardware emulators, where the device tries to mimic another system's hardware configuration to play games in the most accurate way possible. The most popular one right now that has been making the rounds is the Misc kit. I don't have one, but some quick research will get you up to speed on the sheer versatility of it. It's not cheap in any way and will require a learning curve, but the amount of games playable is staggering. Another example of FPGA hardware is the analog products, which target one console specifically to use official or unofficial cartridges with. Not exactly cheap, but still another great way to play retro games if you're interested. A Misc has the potential to play games from many systems, and if you pair it with an upscaler like the 5X, then you'll have quite the versatile setup. I'm lucky enough to already have all the consoles I would want to play, but if I didn't, then I would probably really consider getting a Misc. Some people may ask why bother when you can just use emulators on a PC. Either are fine options, it's just a matter of what fits your setup best. The point of an FPGA, like Misc, is to run games as accurately as possible, as they would on the original console. You can research to find out why that matters to many people, but think of it like another way of preservation. You may have heard of MAME, which is usually associated with arcade games, but really, it's a project to document all the technical specifications of as many games as possible for the sake of knowledge and preservation. Software emulators are just another attempt to deconstruct how a system works in order to run foreign games on a different system. All that matters to a player is options. It may be confusing to take it all in if this is new to you, but the most important thing to know is that you have options. Well, that covers all the basics I can think of in order to get just about anyone started in the pursuit to play retro games. I know I haven't mentioned portable systems in any way in this video, but most of what I said regarding home consoles can still be applied to portables. Just remember the 3 rules from before, and you'll be good to go. So for the rest of this video, I'd like to go over my personal history on how I got into retro games and how I've played them over the years. It started at the young age of about 7 to 8 years old when I was introduced to the angry video game nerd. It's pretty vulgar content for someone as young as I was, but what it did was introduce me into the world of retro games I hadn't known before. Keep in mind, while I did play retro re-releases like Mario Advance and a few others, my gaming knowledge didn't go past N64 and PlayStation, but watching AVGN showed me there was whole generations of games I never saw before. So, at one point, I actually asked for an NES for Christmas and did receive one. Unfortunately, that ownership didn't last long since the coaxial cable broke and my parents returned it to the pawn shop it came from. As compensation, my parents got me a Retron 1, which is a cheap clone console to play the NES games I received. I hadn't mentioned clone consoles since they're not exactly the best way to play retro games, but I was too young to care and made do with it. I played quite a bit of Super Mario Bros. 1 and Mario 3 for a while before getting rid of the Retron and the games I had. Later, I had a bit of a collection reset and started fresh with an N64 and Mario 64, the first console and game I have the earliest vivid memories with. I would then acquire a GameCube and a Wii through a few birthdays and Christmases along with games that interested me since I grew up with those consoles. With the Wii, I would acquire several retro games through the Virtual Console service. I hardly got allowance money, so for a while I would have to wait until Christmas for my grandmother to give me a 2,000-point Wii Shop gift card. I still have my original purchases from long ago, so this may give you an idea of what sort of games I gravitated towards back then. The nostalgic value is pretty high for me, I'm not gonna lie. It's still a shame you can't buy from the Wii Shop anymore. At the beginning of 2013, I started getting introduced to other gaming channels, mainly Some Call Me Johnny. His Sonic reviews were taking off and I ended up binging all of his content, which gave me a new fiery interest in retro games I hadn't felt up to that point. Thanks to AVGN, I had what you may call impressive knowledge on retro games for a 13-year-old in the early 2010s, but thanks to Some Call Me Johnny, I now had a keen desire to play retro games I never considered. It is now the end of 2013, and I managed to get a Wii U for Christmas. I played quite a bit of New Super Mario Bros. U, but I was also transitioning all of my Wii stuff into the Wii U. A real test of patience for those who remember doing that. I remember it sucking pretty hard having to wait for Virtual Console games to be put onto the Wii U eShop. Nintendo decided to release them from scratch all over again, but I digress. As a bonus, the games I bought on the Wii Shop would be discounted on the eShop. Still a ripoff for some, but it was worth it for me at the time since the Wii U Virtual Console had controller button remapping and save states. Very useful features to have, so for me it was a fine upgrade fee. While waiting for games to come to the eShop, I began to hack my Wii and install the homebrew channel since all of my stuff was on my Wii U, and because the Wii is insanely easy to hack. For me, it was so cool. With just an SD card and a cheap-ass Nickelodeon laptop, I could load up any games I want from NES to SNES. And there is a case to be had that the homebrew emulators for the Wii are better than the Wii's own Virtual Console because they offer button mapping, save states, cheats, more controller support, color palettes for NES, etc. Though I didn't spend much time playing games this way, as having that much power sort of devalued the appeal to me. So I continued to wait for new eShop releases. N64 games eventually came to Wii U, and it was there I began to really care about how retro games looked and played. To give context, I had been playing on a cheap CRT all this time until I received my first HD TV for Christmas in 2014. P.S. Playing Wii U on a CRT really sucks and you shouldn't do it. I mostly played on the gamepad until I got an HD TV. When I did though, I did take notice on how Virtual Console games looked a little different on the Wii U compared to how they were on the Wii. You can still play your Wii Virtual Console games via the VWii on your Wii U, so I did several comparisons. Once Mario 64 released on the eShop, I really took notice how much darker the game looked, and how muddier it felt. Believe it or not, this was the first time I ever felt input lag, which normally I'm not that sensitive to. You may not believe me, but I did beat Mr. Dream in Punch-Out on the Wii U twice. It was on a CRT, so I don't know if that affected anything, but everyone says NES on Wii U has pretty bad input lag that I really didn't notice. Mario 64, I did notice, which is a testament on how bad the input lag is for N64 games on Wii U. I adjusted okay enough, and for other games like Ocarina of Time, it's fine. But either way, the Wii U ain't the best way to play N64. But I was okay with it again for the save states and button remapping. More Virtual Console games came to Wii U, and I slowly purchased games that interested me. Like with the Wii, these purchases have nostalgic value for me, and while some may criticize the Wii U Virtual Console, it did its job at letting a 13 to 16-year-old play retro games without access to the original consoles, and the convenience of all playable on one system. The next big step into my retro gaming journey would be when, in 2016, my friend, owner of a lot of my personal collection, would introduce me to the My Life in Gaming channel. He came to me with the prospect that I could be playing the retro games I'm already playing, but with sharp emulator quality pixels on the original consoles no less. At first I scoffed at that silly idea, thinking that playing on Wii U already provides the best video quality. Well, eventually I would check out My Life in Gaming and would have my mind blown once again at the forbidden truth. Playing retro games on original hardware really can have cleaner video quality than the emulated alternatives. I simply must have it. The one retro console I had at the time was the N64 from my collection reset. I didn't play it much though, since it hardly worked. Luckily, I was getting comfortable with opening consoles and controllers to restore them after years of abuse. After taking apart my N64 and cleaning the interiors, it started working much more reliably. I purchased an OSSC after another game channel I was following, Exo Paradigm Gamer, gushed over it on Twitter. I then bought an N64 RGB mod kit from Voltar in late 2017 and installed it in early 2018. This was my first ever attempt at soldering, and it's a miracle the console still works. It took me several hours, and to call it an amateur job would be an understatement. Either way, what matters is that it worked, and with the OSSC, I saw what N64 on original hardware looks like with razor-sharp pixels. I could hardly believe it then, and I still find it incredible now. From there, my friend and I worked together to snag any retro game that mattered to us. I bought a SNES Junior and sent it to Voltar for mod work after my N64 soldering experience. Seeing Super Nintendo games with such pixel clarity was surreal to me because sure, at this point I was used to how clean they looked on emulators, but to have it come from the original console was so cool to me, and it still is. My ultimate achievement in this came when I saved enough money to have my NES modded. This NES actually belonged to my closest friend who contributed to the retro collection, and before it was his mother's. This NES was actually the reason we became friends to begin with back in 6th grade, since he was the only other one in school who had familiarity with retro games, with the NES being the initial conversation starter. I totally fucked up and wiped away the text on the front door of it when I tried cleaning it, so I replaced it with a font sticker. Looks alright, doesn't it? Anyway, having an NES RGB modded is trickier than N64 and Super Nintendo since there's more to consider. After saving enough money, I bought Tim Worthington's RGB kit and sent it to Voltar, who fitted the NES with a region-free bypass, enhanced stereo audio, a Nintendo multi-out port, and 3 color palettes of my choosing. The total cost was over $300, but it's my way to honor the long-standing friendship. My friend and I would then work together to get some EverDrives to add to the collection, after which my retro gaming agenda would shift again. I had been playing retro games with sharp pixels for so long at this point that I started to gain a reappreciation of the CRT look these games were originally viewed on. I've always had an underlying preference for this look that was buried for a while but was surfacing once again. I'd played games on a CRT for so long until I was 15 years old when I got that HD TV for Christmas back in 2014. Before that, I would play retro games on a Wii via Virtual Console on a CRT. The cool thing about that is that many Virtual Console games on Wii would look really close to how they looked on the original consoles when played on a CRT, as they were 240p and would have scan lines and the like. This is not a thing on Wii U. So I wanted to play on CRT again. Luckily, my friend was ready to provide once again when he gifted me his childhood Sony Trinitron. I began to play retro games again this way and relished in the newfound appreciation. My collection at this point was steadily growing. I acquired a PS1, PS2, games for both, HDMI adapter for GameCube, a bunch of Game Boys with games, and an assload of controllers. Compared to other gaming channels, this still isn't anything much to brag about, but it's a personal collection that means a lot to me. The RetroTink 5X would then come out and effectively replace the OSSC for me. Mike Chi, the creator of RetroTink, would then implement CRT-style filters for the 5X, which does a remarkable job imitating the CRT look that's hard to replicate on HD TVs. So much so that, honestly, had the 5X and its filters been available earlier, I may have never invested so much into having my retro consoles modded. Either way, I'm very happy with my own little collection as it represents years of work and years of fun playing games. Of course, I'll always check out whatever new game that comes out that interests me, but the simple pick-up-and-play nature of retro games will always have an appeal to me. Playing games is a memorable experience, like with any other art form. You're never going to forget the first time playing a game that leaves an impact on you, nor will you forget the memories gained from playing games. And that's why I'll always love retro games, as they represent memories of playing those games for the very first time, a simpler time. Regardless of that, many of these games hold up extremely well and are still fun to play to this day. If someone like me can have such a memorable time playing through retro games long after they came out, I like to think just about anyone can. I hope this silly little video was helpful to those who may want to get into retro games. I'll be honest, this video originally started as just an excuse to flex off my collection, but then I wanted to provide something more. A retro gaming for dummies kind of thing to hopefully be a useful starting point for retro newcomers. If you'd like to learn more, then once again, I highly recommend My Life in Gaming, Retro RGB, and Digital Foundry Retro, as well as Voltar's channel if you want to learn more about soldering and console modding. Retro gaming may not quite be the same as it used to be, but the possibilities seem endless now with dedicated fans putting the work to keep retro gaming alive. I'm excited to see what the future holds and what new advancements come to keep the retro gaming experience fresh. I do think that will be it for me today, so I just want to say thank you for watching.